Fear is perhaps the most universal of all human experiences. It has walked beside human beings since the very beginning. We accept it as just part of being alive. But what if there was another way to live? Tonight, we will discover what the Buddha said about this uninvited guest called fear. We will explore together what fear truly is, where it comes from, and how we might gently set it down, not through force or struggle, but through understanding. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. What you will hear tonight are stories and reflections that reveal something the ancients understood. The same mind that creates our fear also holds the key to our freedom. As we journey through these teachings, know that you do not need to remember everything. Simply receive what speaks to you and let the rest drift away. Wherever you are right now, let yourself settle. Take a slow, deep breath. Let's begin our journey together. Fear is one of the great uninvited guests of human life. It arrives without warning, settles into the corners of our minds, and so often refuses to leave. It is there when we wake in the early morning hours, worrying about tomorrow. It is there when we face decisions, whispering of all that could go wrong. It is there in our relationships, in our work, in our quiet moments alone. And yet, despite how familiar fear is to us, we rarely stop to truly understand it. We simply feel its grip and assume that grip is telling us something true about the world. The ancient teachers understood that fear is one of the greatest obstacles to peace. It prevents us from resting in the present moment. It steals our joy even when we are safe and well. It creates tension in the body and turbulence in the mind. But here is something remarkable. The very same part of us that creates fear also holds the key to its release. The imagination that creates dark possibilities can also open doors to peace. The mind that worries about what might go wrong can also rest in what might go right. Understanding this is the first step toward freedom. Let us begin with a story. There is a tale told in certain monasteries about a young student and his teacher, an elderly monk known for his gentle wisdom and unshakable calm. The two had been walking together through a great forest, returning from a distant village where they had offered teachings to a small community. The morning had been clear when they set out, but by afternoon the sky had turned the color of slate. The wind began to stir, at first gently, and then with growing insistence. The leaves overhead shivered and whispered, and the student noticed the birds had fallen silent in that particular way that creatures do when they sense something approaching. Then the storm arrived. It came with a sound like a great wave, a rushing and roaring that swept through the canopy above. Rain began to fall, first in scattered drops and then in sheets that soaked through robes in moments. The wind bent the smaller trees nearly to the ground and set the ancient ones swaying and groaning like old men in pain. The student had never seen anything like it. All around them, branches were snapping and crashing down through the undergrowth. He could hear, somewhere in the distance, the sound of an entire tree surrendering to the wind, the slow crack and the thunderous impact as it struck the earth. The path they walked grew treacherous. The rain had turned the ground to mud, and the light was failing though it was only afternoon. Each gust of wind brought new debris raining down, and the student found himself flinching at every sound, his shoulders hunched, his hands trembling. He tried to keep walking, tried to follow the calm figure of his teacher ahead of him on the path, but his legs grew heavy. his breath short. The fear that had been building in his chest finally overflowed, and he could go no further. He stopped in the middle of the path and called out to his teacher, "I cannot go on. I cannot take another step." The old monk turned back and looked at his student with eyes full of compassion. He walked back through the rain to stand beside the young man, patient and unhurried despite the chaos around them. "What troubles you, dear one?" The student's voice came out thin and strained. "What if a tree falls while we are beneath it? What if the next crash is the one that finds us? I keep seeing it in my mind, the branches coming down, and I cannot make the picture stop." The old monk was quiet for a moment. Around them, the storm continued its wild song. Rain streamed down the monk's face, but he seemed not to notice. He simply stood with his student in the midst of the tempest, as steady as a mountain. And then something shifted in the monk's eyes. A gentle light, almost like amusement, though not unkind. He placed a hand on his student's shoulder. "I understand. You are asking yourself, what would happen if a tree fell while we were beneath it? And this question has filled you with fear." The student nodded, unable to speak. "Then let me offer you another question," the monk said. "What would happen if a tree did not fall while we were beneath it?" The student blinked. The rain continued to fall. The wind continued to blow. But something in the question had caught him off guard, like a door opening in a wall he had thought was solid. What would happen if we walked safely through this forest and emerged on the other side, wet perhaps, tired perhaps, but whole and well? What if the branches that fall miss us by a wide margin? What if we arrive at the monastery by evening and sit by a warm fire, grateful for the adventure we have survived? The young student stood very still. He could feel the fear still present in his body, the tightness in his chest, the trembling in his limbs. But alongside that fear, something else was emerging. A small opening, a tiny window of light. "That is also possible," he whispered. "Yes," said the monk. "That is also possible. In fact, it is far more likely. Consider how many trees surround us. Consider how few are falling. Consider how large this forest is and how small we are. The chances of a tree striking us in this very moment are quite small. But you have been living as though it were certain, as though disaster had already arrived." The student looked around at the forest with new eyes. The storm was still fierce, the rain still cold, the wind still howling. Nothing had changed in the outer world, but something had shifted in the inner one. "Fear," the old monk continued, "is always the same question. What would happen if, followed by something terrible? Our minds are very skilled at imagining catastrophe. We have been doing it since we were small, since we lived in more dangerous times when such vigilance kept us alive. But that ancient habit of mind does not serve us well in most moments of our lives. It keeps us frightened of dangers that may never come." He began to walk again, slowly, and the student found that his legs would carry him after all. The medicine for fear is the same question with a different ending. What would happen if, followed by something good? What would happen if this works out? What would happen if I am safe? What would happen if the very thing I dread never comes to pass? These questions are not denial. They are balance. They are remembering that the future holds many possibilities, not only the dark ones our fear prefers to show us. They walked on together through the storm. The rain began to ease. The wind grew calmer. And by evening, just as the monk had suggested might happen, they reached the edge of the forest and saw the lights of the monastery glowing warm in the distance. They had walked through the storm and emerged on the other side. What can we learn from this simple story? Perhaps more than it first appears. The Buddha taught that our suffering comes not from the world itself, but from how we meet the world in our minds. He said that we are disturbed not by things, but by the views we take of things. Two people can face the same situation, the same storm, and experience it completely differently based on what is happening in their own minds. The young student in the forest was suffering not primarily because of the storm. He was suffering because of the pictures his mind was creating, the vivid images of disaster, the certainty that something terrible was about to happen. His imagination had run ahead of him down the darkest possible path, and he was experiencing the emotions of that imagined catastrophe as though it were already real. This is what fear does. It takes a possibility, often a remote one, and presents it to us as though it were inevitable. It focuses our attention so completely on what might go wrong that we lose sight of all the ways things might go right. It narrows our vision until the world seems full of nothing but danger. And here is something important to understand. The body does not know the difference between real danger and imagined danger. When we vividly picture something terrible happening, our hearts race, our muscles tense, our breathing grows shallow. We experience all the physical sensations of facing a true threat, even when we are perfectly safe. We exhaust ourselves fighting enemies that exist only in our thoughts. The old monk understood this. He did not try to argue with his student's fear or dismiss it as foolish. He simply offered a different question, a different direction for the imagination to travel. And in doing so, he opened a door that had seemed locked. What would happen if things went well? This is not naive optimism or positive thinking that ignores reality. It is balance. It is remembering that when we ask what might go wrong, we should also ask what might go right. Both questions point to possibilities. Neither points to certainties. But one fills us with dread while the other allows us to breathe. There is another dimension to this teaching that deserves our attention. Fear does not only make us suffer in the present moment, it also shapes the future in troubling ways. When we are afraid, we become tense. Our bodies stiffen. Our minds narrow. We lose access to our natural grace and wisdom. We become reactive instead of responsive, jerky instead of fluid. And this tension, this stiffness, often brings about the very outcomes we fear. Consider someone who is afraid of failing at something important. Perhaps they are about to give a presentation, or take a test, or have a difficult conversation. Their fear tells them this could go badly. And so they tense up. They rehearse worst-case scenarios. They lie awake at night, worrying. And when the moment arrives, they are exhausted, tight, unable to access their natural abilities. Their fear has made failure more likely, not less. Or consider someone who fears being abandoned by someone they love. Their fear tells them this person might leave you. And so they become clingy, suspicious, controlling. They question and doubt. They cannot relax into the relationship. And their partner, feeling smothered and mistrusted, eventually does leave. Their fear has created the very thing they dreaded. This is one of fear's cruelest tricks. It presents itself as protection, as vigilance keeping us safe. But so often it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, steering us toward the disasters we are trying to avoid. The ancient teachers spoke of this in terms of karma, the way our mental states create ripples that shape our future experience. A mind filled with fear sends out fear into the world and tends to receive fearful experiences in return. A mind at peace sends out peace and tends to receive peaceful experiences. This is not magic or superstition. It is simply the recognition that how we are inside affects how we act, and how we act affects what happens to us. The fearful person makes different choices than the peaceful person. They take different actions. They respond to events in different ways. And over time, these differences compound into very different lives. Let us explore another story, one that illustrates this principle in a different way. There was once a child who received, for a birthday, the gift of a bicycle. It was the first bicycle this child had ever owned, and the excitement was immense. Within moments of receiving it, the child was outside, ready to learn to ride. But learning to ride a bicycle is not easy. The machine seems determined to fall over at every opportunity. And this child, like so many children before, kept falling. What the child did not realize was that fear was the culprit. With each wobble, the child's hands gripped the handlebars more tightly. With each near fall, the muscles tensed further. Before long, the child was holding on so tightly that the knuckles had turned white, the arms had become rigid as boards, the entire body had stiffened into a kind of statue. And it was precisely this rigidity that made balance impossible. A bicycle wants to be ridden by someone who can flow with it. When it tips slightly to the left, the rider must soften and shift slightly to compensate. When the path curves, the body must lean into the turn. The whole art of cycling is a conversation between rider and machine, a constant series of tiny adjustments. But a rigid rider cannot adjust. A tense body cannot flow. And so the child kept falling, not despite the fear, but because of it. It was only later, after many tumbles, that the child discovered the secret. Relaxation. Softness. Letting the body respond naturally instead of trying to control every movement through sheer force of will. When the grip loosened, when the shoulders dropped, when the breath flowed freely, something wonderful happened. The bicycle stopped fighting and started cooperating. Balance came naturally. The fall stopped. And the child rode off down the street, finally free. This is such a beautiful metaphor for how fear operates in our lives. We grip tightly because we are afraid of falling. But it is the gripping itself that makes us fall. We control because we are afraid of losing control. But it is the controlling that creates chaos. The spiritual path in many traditions is precisely this discovery. That letting go is safer than holding on. That softness is stronger than rigidity. That relaxation opens doors that effort keeps closed. How might we work with these teachings in our own lives? The first step is simply to notice when fear arises. This sounds obvious, but it is actually quite profound. So often we experience fear without recognizing it as fear. We feel tension, unease, worry, dread, and we do not pause to name what is happening. We simply react, gripping tighter, trying harder to control. When we notice fear, we can begin to observe it with some curiosity. What is the fear actually about? What is the terrible thing I am imagining might happen? Often, just making this explicit can begin to loosen fear's grip. The vague sense of dread becomes a specific concern, and specific concerns can be examined. Then we can ask the balancing question: what would happen if this turned out well? What would happen if my fear was wrong? What is a positive possibility that is at least as likely as the negative one I have been fixating on? This is not about lying to ourselves or pretending everything is fine when it is not. It is about restoring balance to an imagination that has tipped too far into darkness. It is about remembering that we do not know the future, and that if we are going to speculate about it, we might as well speculate in ways that bring us peace. We can also practice relaxing the body. Fear lives in the body as tension, and we can address it directly through the body. When we notice we are afraid, we can consciously soften the shoulders, relax the jaw, let the belly go loose. We can take deeper breaths, longer exhales. We can feel our feet on the ground and remember that in this moment, right now, we are safe. The Buddha taught a practice of cultivating peaceful mental states intentionally. Just as we might cultivate a garden, pulling weeds and planting flowers, we can cultivate the garden of the mind. When fear arises, we acknowledge it with kindness, and then we gently redirect attention toward peace, toward safety, toward trust in the unfolding of life. This takes practice. The habit of fear is often deeply ingrained, woven into our nervous systems since childhood. We will not transform it overnight. But each time we choose a peaceful thought over a fearful one, each time we soften instead of tighten, we are planting seeds. And over time, those seeds grow into a different way of being. There is one more teaching hidden in the story of the student and the monk in the storm. The student's fear came from certainty, the certainty that disaster was about to strike. But this certainty was false. The student did not actually know what was going to happen. He was treating his fearful imagination as though it were prophetic truth, when in fact, it was just one possible story among many. The monk's gift was to remind him of his own not knowing. Neither of them knew what would happen. The future was genuinely uncertain, and in that uncertainty, there was room for hope as well as fear, room for peaceful possibilities as well as frightening ones. We so often suffer because we forget that we do not know. We project our fears onto the blank screen of the future and then react as though we were watching a documentary rather than a creation of our own minds. True wisdom includes a deep comfort with not knowing. It is the recognition that life is uncertain and that this uncertainty, while sometimes uncomfortable, is also the source of all possibility. Every good thing that has ever happened to you was once something you did not know was coming. The future that feels so threatening is the same future that holds all the beauty and joy and love you have not yet experienced. When we can rest in not knowing, fear loses much of its power. We stop pretending we can see what is coming. We stop exhausting ourselves preparing for disasters that may never arrive. We become present to what is actually here, in this moment, rather than lost in what might be there, in some imagined future. This is peace. This is freedom. This is walking through the storm with eyes open and heart at ease. As we come to the end of this first exploration, let us return to the image of those two figures walking through the forest. The storm still raging around them, but something different in their bearing now. Not denial of the danger, but not paralysis either. simply walking, one step at a time, trusting that the path would hold, trusting that most of the trees would stay standing, trusting that they would find their way through. The Buddha once said that just as a single flame can light 1,000 candles without diminishing itself, so too can one moment of peaceful awareness begin to illuminate an entire life. We do not have to eliminate fear all at once. We simply have to begin. One moment of choosing peace over panic. One breath of softening instead of tightening. One question asked in a different direction. What would happen if things turned out well? What would happen if you were safe? What would happen if the storm passed and you found yourself, tired perhaps, wet perhaps, but whole and grateful, standing in the warm light on the other side? That is also possible. In fact, it may be exactly what is waiting for you. Let these thoughts settle gently, like leaves coming to rest on still water. Take a slow breath, and when you are ready, we will continue together. We have begun to see that fear is a kind of storytelling. It is the mind spinning tales about a future that has not yet arrived, focusing always on the darkest possibilities while forgetting the light. And we have seen that we can gently shift this storytelling, asking ourselves not only what might go wrong, but also what might go right. But there is more to understand about fear. It does not live only in our thoughts. It lives in our bodies. It shapes our muscles, our breath, our very posture. And through the body, fear reaches out into the world and begins to shape events themselves. This is perhaps the most important teaching about fear. It is not merely unpleasant. It is creative. It tends to bring about the very outcomes it warns us against. Understanding this deeply can change how we relate to fear forever. Let us explore how this works. When fear arises, it does not stay in the mind alone. It immediately begins to express itself through the body. The shoulders rise and tighten. The jaw clenches. The belly hardens. The breath becomes shallow and quick, caught high in the chest rather than flowing deep into the belly. These are ancient responses, wired into us from a time when our ancestors faced physical dangers that required immediate action. When a predator appeared, the body needed to be ready to fight or flee. Muscles tensed for action. Breath quickened to supply oxygen. The whole system shifted into a state of high alert. This response served us well in the wild. But in modern life, we activate it constantly in situations where it does not help us at all. We feel the same physical alarm when we worry about a meeting at work, or an unpaid bill, or a relationship that feels uncertain. Our bodies prepare for a tiger that is not there. And here is the difficulty. When we are in this state of physical tension, we do not function well. Our thinking becomes narrow and rigid. Our reactions become jerky and impulsive. We lose access to our creativity, our wisdom, our natural grace. We become, in a sense, less capable precisely when we feel we need to be most capable. There is an old teaching that compares a tense mind to a cup of muddy water. When we shake the cup, trying to see clearly, the mud swirls and the water becomes even more clouded. But when we set the cup down and let it be still, the mud settles naturally to the bottom and the water becomes clear. Fear shakes the cup. Relaxation lets it settle. Consider someone who is very worried about their health. They have read something frightening, perhaps, or or they have a family history that concerns them. Fear begins to whisper its dark stories. What if you become ill? What if something is already wrong inside you that you do not know about? As this fear takes hold, the body responds. Shoulders tighten. Sleep becomes difficult. The appetite changes. There is a constant low level of stress humming through the system, day after day, week after week. Now, we know that chronic stress is genuinely harmful to health. It weakens the immune system. It creates inflammation. It prevents the body from doing its natural work of repair and renewal. The very fear of becoming ill creates conditions in the body that make illness more likely. This is not a reason to add more fear, to become afraid of being afraid. It is simply an invitation to notice the pattern. The gripping does not protect us. It harms us. The way forward is not more vigilance, but more release. Or consider someone who fears having an accident while traveling. Every time they set out on a journey, their mind fills with images of disaster. They grip the steering wheel tightly. They startle at every unexpected movement around them. Their body is tense. Their reactions are sharp and jerky. Their attention is scattered by anxiety. A relaxed traveler responds smoothly to unexpected events. They have full access to their reflexes and judgment. They can assess situations clearly and act appropriately. But a frightened traveler overreacts, braking too hard or swerving too suddenly. Their tension creates exactly the kind of erratic behavior that leads to accidents. Again, the grip creates the fall. Have you ever noticed that some people seem to move through life with remarkable ease? Things seem to work out for them. They face the same uncertainties as everyone else, but somehow they emerge unscathed, even blessed. We might call them lucky, but perhaps something else is at work. These fortunate ones often share a common quality. They do not grip. They do not spend their days worrying about what might go wrong. They take life as it comes, responding to each moment with a kind of relaxed presence that allows them to dance with whatever arises. This is not naivety or denial. Many of these people have faced real difficulties in their lives. They know that hard things happen, but they have learned somehow that worrying about hard things does not prevent them. It only steals the peace of the present moment and clouds the judgment we need when challenges actually arrive. The Buddha spoke of this quality as a kind of equanimity, a steadiness of heart that remains balanced regardless of conditions. Pleasant or unpleasant, easy or difficult, the equanimous heart remains open and at ease. This is not coldness or indifference. It is a deep trust in one's own capacity to meet whatever comes. And here is the remarkable thing. This trust tends to create good outcomes. The person who is relaxed and present makes better decisions. They see more clearly. They respond more skillfully. They do not waste their energy on imaginary problems, so they have more energy for real ones. Their very ease becomes a kind of protection. We might say that fear creates what it fears, and trust creates what it trusts. Both are self-fulfilling prophecies. We get to choose which prophecy we want to live. Perhaps nowhere is this pattern more visible than in our relationships with others. When we love someone, we become vulnerable. We have something precious that could be lost. And for many of us, this vulnerability awakens deep fear. What if they leave? What if they betray our trust? What if they stop loving us? What if we are not enough? These fears, when they take hold, begin to shape how we behave. We become vigilant, watching for signs of trouble. We become controlling, trying to prevent the disaster we imagine. We become clingy, seeking constant reassurance that everything is still all right. We become jealous, suspicious of anyone who might threaten what we have. And all of these behaviors push the other person away. No one wants to be constantly watched and doubted. No one wants to feel controlled. No one wants to be the endless source of reassurance for someone else's anxiety. The very behaviors that come from fear of losing love make us harder to love. There is a teaching that says we cannot hold water by grasping it. The tighter we squeeze, the more it escapes through our fingers. But if we simply cup our hands gently, the water rests there peacefully. Love is like this. When we try to grip it tightly, we crush it. When we try to control it, we suffocate it. But when we can hold it gently, with open hands and a trusting heart, it stays. This is one of the great paradoxes of intimate life. The security we seek cannot be created through control. It can only arise from its opposite, from the willingness to not control, to let the other person be free, to trust that love given freely is the only love worth having. There is a story about a person who tried very hard to be the perfect partner in a relationship. This person had been hurt before, had experienced the pain of love lost, and was determined that this would not happen again. And so they tried to do everything right. They monitored themselves constantly, watching for mistakes. They anticipated their partner's every need, trying to prevent any disappointment. They kept a running account in their mind of how the relationship was going, analyzing each interaction for signs of trouble. They became, in a word, exhausting. Their partner began to feel watched, evaluated, managed. What had started as a spontaneous and joyful connection began to feel like a performance, with one person always in the audience taking notes. The space for relaxation and authenticity slowly disappeared. Eventually, the partner said something that surprised them both. "I feel like I am living with someone who is afraid of me. Like you are constantly bracing for me to hurt you. And it makes me feel like a monster, even though I have done nothing wrong." The person who was trying so hard to be perfect suddenly saw what they had been doing. Their fear of losing love had created a barrier to love. Their vigilance had become a wall. Their very effort to hold the relationship together was pushing it apart. This is such an important teaching. In relationships, as in riding a bicycle, we must learn to soften. We must learn to trust. We must let go of the desperate grip that comes from fear and open our hands to whatever wants to happen. This does not mean we become careless or indifferent. It means we offer our presence, our kindness, our authentic self, and then we let the relationship find its own shape. We cannot control another person. We can only show up fully and let love do what love does. How does one begin to release the physical grip of fear? It starts with simply noticing. So often, we walk around in states of chronic tension without realizing it. Our shoulders have been raised for so long that we have forgotten what relaxation feels like. Our jaws have been clenched for so many years that we no longer notice the tightness. Our bellies have been held in, braced against some imagined blow, until hardness feels normal. When we begin to pay attention to the body, we often discover how much tension we have been carrying without knowing it. And something interesting happens in that noticing. The simple act of becoming aware of tension often begins to release it. Attention itself is a kind of permission. It says to the body, you can let go now. You can soften. You are safe. The Buddha taught that the body and mind are not separate things but one continuous system. What happens in the mind affects the body, and what happens in the body affects the mind. This means that physical relaxation is not separate from mental peace. When the shoulders drop, something in the mind drops too. When the belly softens, something in the heart softens as well. Those who have studied the body's wisdom tell us that we store our experiences in our muscles, our tissues, our very cells. The fears we have carried, the tensions we have held, leave their traces in the body. And the body, in its own quiet way, can help us release what the mind has struggled to let go. This is why so many contemplative traditions include attention to the body as part of their path. Not as a separate practice, but as an essential doorway. When we learn to be at ease in our bodies, we are learning to be at ease in our lives. Underneath all of this is a question of trust. When we fear, we are essentially saying that we do not trust life to take care of us. We do not trust ourselves to handle what comes. We do not trust the future to hold anything good. This lack of trust is understandable. Many of us have been hurt. Many of us have experienced times when life was not kind, when our trust was betrayed, when terrible things happened despite our best efforts. It makes sense that we would become wary, vigilant, self-protective. But there is a difference between reasonable caution and chronic fear. Reasonable caution says, let me look both ways before crossing the street. Chronic fear says, I cannot leave the house because something terrible might happen. The path forward is not to pretend we have never been hurt or that nothing bad can happen. The path forward is to develop a different kind of trust. Not trust that everything will go perfectly, but trust that we can handle whatever comes. Trust in our own resilience. Trust in the support that surrounds us. Trust that even difficult experiences contain the seeds of growth and wisdom. There is a teaching that compares a person of trust to a great tree. When storms come, the tree does not fight the wind. It bends. Its branches sway. It allows the storm to move through it. And when the storm passes, the tree is still standing, perhaps with some leaves lost, perhaps with some branches broken, but fundamentally whole. A rigid tree, one that refuses to bend, is the one that breaks. We can learn to be like the great tree. Rooted, stable, present, but also flexible, yielding, willing to dance with whatever winds blow through our lives. This is trust. This is the opposite of the fearful grip that makes us fall. As we come to the end of this exploration, let us return to that image of the child on the bicycle. The white knuckles slowly relaxing. The stiff body beginning to soften. The wobbling machine beginning to steady as the rider learns to flow rather than fight. This is the invitation for all of us. Not to try harder to control life, but to soften our grip. Not to be more vigilant against danger, but to be more trusting of our own capacity to respond. Not to brace against the future, but to open to it with curiosity and ease. The Dhammapada, an ancient collection of the Buddha's sayings, tells us that those who are free from fear are truly happy. This happiness is available to us. It is not somewhere else, waiting for circumstances to improve. It is here, now, in this very moment, waiting only for us to release the grip that keeps it at bay. What might your life look like with a little less fear? What might become possible if you trusted yourself, trusted life, just a little bit more? You do not have to figure it all out at once. You do not have to become fearless overnight. It is enough to simply begin. To notice, here and there, where the grip is tight. To allow, now and then, a little softening. One small release at a time. One moment of trust at a time. This is how we learn to ride. This is how we learn to live. Rest here for a moment before we continue on together. We have been exploring how fear lives in the body, how it tightens our muscles and stiffens our movements, how the very act of gripping creates the falls we hope to prevent. Now let us turn to perhaps the most tender territory of all, the territory of the heart. It is in our relationships with others that fear shows its most painful face. When we love, we become vulnerable. When we open our hearts, we create the possibility of being hurt. And for many of us, this vulnerability awakens ancient fears that can slowly poison the very connections we treasure most. There is something both beautiful and terrifying about caring deeply for another person. We find ourselves bound to them in ways we did not choose and cannot fully control. Their happiness becomes our happiness. Their pain becomes our pain. We discover that we are no longer entirely separate, that our well-being has become entangled with theirs in the most intimate way. This entanglement is the very nature of love. It is what makes love so precious and so powerful. But it is also what makes love feel so dangerous to the fearful mind. When we have something precious, we have something to lose. And the fear of loss can begin to overshadow the joy of having. The Buddha spoke often of love, of compassion, of the deep bonds between beings. He taught that our relationships are among our greatest teachers, mirrors that show us ourselves, opportunities to practice the most profound qualities of the human heart. But he also recognized that relationships can become tangled with fear, and that this tangling creates immense suffering. Let us look closely at how this happens, and how we might find our way to something more free. When we enter into a close relationship, whether with a partner, a dear friend, or a family member, something tender begins to grow. We start to depend on this person. We start to need them. We start to imagine a future that includes them. And alongside this beautiful growth, a small seed of fear often takes root as well. What if they leave? What if they change? What if they discover something about us that makes them turn away? What if this precious thing we are building together falls apart? These fears are natural. They arise precisely because we care. If we did not love, we would not fear losing. The fear is, in a strange way, a measure of how much the relationship means to us. But here is where things become complicated. When fear takes hold in a relationship, it begins to change how we behave. We become watchful. We look for signs of trouble. We interpret small things as evidence of larger problems. This watchfulness is exhausting, both for us and for the one we love. It creates an atmosphere of tension, of being evaluated, of never quite being good enough. And slowly, this atmosphere begins to erode the very foundation of the relationship. This brings us to trust. Trust is the soil in which love grows. Without trust, love cannot put down roots. It remains shallow, fragile, easily disturbed by the slightest wind. With trust, love can grow deep and strong, weathering storms that would destroy a more superficial connection. But here is what fear does not understand. Trust cannot be created through vigilance. It cannot be built through control. It cannot be secured by watching and checking and making sure. In fact, these very behaviors destroy trust rather than create it. When we watch someone closely, we are communicating that we do not trust them. When we check up on them, we are saying that their word is not enough. When we try to control their behavior, we are treating them as a threat to be managed rather than a person to be loved. And they feel this. Even if they cannot name it, they feel the absence of trust. They feel the presence of fear. And something in them begins to withdraw, to protect itself, to close off the very openness that made intimacy possible. This is one of the great sorrows of relational fear. The person gripped by fear is often trying so hard to protect the relationship. They are watching because they care. They are controlling because they cannot bear to lose what they have found. Their intentions are good, even loving, but the impact of their behavior is the opposite of what they intend. The watched person feels like a suspect rather than a beloved. The controlled person feels like a prisoner rather than a partner. And slowly, imperceptibly, love begins to wither in the atmosphere of suspicion. There is an old teaching that compares trust to a bird. If you want a bird to stay with you, you must open your hand and let it be free. The moment you try to grasp it, to close your fingers around it, the bird will struggle and fight to escape. But an open hand, a hand that offers rest without imprisonment, is a hand a bird might choose to return to again and again. Our relationships are like this. The people we love must be free to choose us. And they can only truly choose us if they are genuinely free not to. The paradox is that security in relationship comes not from preventing the other person from leaving, but from knowing that they stay because they want to, freely, in each moment. This is a difficult teaching for the fearful heart. It asks us to release control precisely when we feel most afraid. It asks us to open our hands precisely when we most want to grasp. But there is no other way. The grip that seeks to secure love is the grip that crushes it. Fear in relationships often wears a particular mask, the mask of perfectionism. We become afraid of making mistakes, afraid of disappointing, afraid of being seen as flawed. And so we try harder and harder to be perfect, to do everything right, to never give our loved one any reason to be unhappy with us. There is a story about a young person who entered a contemplative community, eager to live a life of depth and meaning. This person had experienced pain in the past, had known what it was to be rejected and found wanting, and was determined that this would not happen again. And so they tried with all their might to be the perfect member of the community. They followed every guideline with meticulous care. They watched themselves constantly for any sign of error. They anticipated what others might need and tried to provide it before being asked. They kept a running score in their mind, tracking their successes and failures, always pushing themselves to do better. The effort was tremendous. Every day was a battle against imperfection. Every interaction was a test to be passed. There was no rest, no ease, no simple enjoyment of the life they had chosen. Only the endless striving to be good enough. And the strangest thing began to happen. Despite all this effort, or perhaps because of it, the person began to feel more and more disconnected from the community they had joined. The other members seemed distant, hard to reach. The warmth and belonging they had hoped to find remained elusive. They worked harder and harder, and the connection they sought seemed to slip further and further away. Eventually, a kind teacher noticed their struggle and offered some words that changed everything. "You are trying so hard to be perfect that there is no room for you to simply be here. You are so busy performing that you have forgotten to participate. The others do not need you to be flawless. They need you to be real." The young person was stunned. They had thought that perfection was the price of belonging. They had thought that any mistake would lead to rejection. But here was a different teaching altogether. Perhaps belonging required something other than perfection. Perhaps it required authenticity, vulnerability, the willingness to be seen as one truly was, imperfections and all. What that young person discovered is something that applies far beyond contemplative communities. It applies to every relationship we will ever have. When we try to be perfect, we are essentially hiding. We are presenting a polished surface, a curated version of ourselves, while keeping our true self concealed behind it. We think this will make us more lovable, but in fact, it makes genuine love impossible. How can someone love us if they do not know us? How can they accept us if we never show them who we actually are? There is a teaching that says we are most beautiful not when we are flawless, but when we are real. A face that shows the lines of laughter and tears is more beautiful than a face frozen in artificial smoothness. A heart that has been broken and healed is more beautiful than a heart that has never risked anything. Our imperfections are not obstacles to love. They are invitations to love. When we allow ourselves to be imperfect in front of another person, we are offering them a tremendous gift. We are saying, "I trust you enough to let you see me as I am. I trust you enough to be vulnerable with you. I trust you enough to stop performing." And this gift invites a gift in return. When one person risks being real, it gives the other person permission to be real as well. The masks can come off. The performance can end. And what remains is two actual human beings, meeting each other in the tender space of mutual vulnerability. This is intimacy. This is connection. This is what we were looking for all along, hidden beneath all our striving to be perfect. Fear does something particular to our presence. It makes us tight, contracted, hard to be with. When we are afraid, we are not fully available to the moment or to the people in it. Part of us is always somewhere else, watching, calculating, worrying about what might happen next. Think about what it feels like to be with someone who is truly relaxed. There is a quality of spaciousness around them. They are fully present, not distracted by anxiety or preoccupied with their own concerns. They listen when you speak. They see you when they look at you. There is room for you to be yourself in their presence, because they are not filling all the space with their own tension. Now think about what it feels like to be with someone who is gripped by fear. There is a tightness around them, a feeling of pressure. They may be physically present, but their attention is scattered. They are watching for danger, managing their impression, trying to control outcomes. There is not much room for you in their presence, because they are so full of their own worry. We are naturally drawn to relaxed people and naturally uncomfortable around tense ones. This is not a judgment. It is simply how we are built. We can feel the difference, even if we cannot always name it. And we gravitate toward the spaciousness, the ease, the open presence that allows us to breathe. If we want to be good partners, good friends, good family members, one of the greatest gifts we can offer is our own relaxation. Not because we have solved all our problems or eliminated all our fears, but because we have learned to hold them lightly. We have learned to be present despite them. We have learned that our fears do not have to run the show. Is it possible to love without fear? The ancient teachers suggest that it is, though perhaps not in the way we might imagine. The Buddha taught about a quality called metta, often translated as loving kindness or unconditional friendliness. This is a love that does not depend on the other person behaving in a certain way. It does not depend on outcomes. It does not depend on being loved in return. It is simply an orientation of the heart toward goodwill, offered freely without demand. This kind of love is remarkably free from fear. When we love without conditions, there is nothing to lose. When we offer kindness without requiring anything in return, rejection loses its sting. The gift has already been given. The love has already been expressed. Whatever happens next does not diminish what has already been offered. The traditional teachings describe metta as being like the sun, which shines on all things equally without discrimination. The sun does not shine only on those who appreciate it, or only on those who deserve it. It simply shines, because that is its nature. And in the shining itself, the sun is fulfilled. We can learn to love like this. Not perfectly, not all the time, but more and more as we practice. We can learn to offer our warmth without keeping score. We can learn to wish others well without needing them to wish us well in return. We can learn to let our love be its own reward. This is not the same as not caring. It is not indifference wearing the mask of spirituality. It is actually a more intense form of caring, because it is not diluted by self-protection. It is love that has set down the burden of fear and become pure, light, free. We may not be able to love this way all the time. We are human, and our hearts are tender, and we will sometimes feel afraid. But we can move in this direction. We can practice offering love without gripping. We can notice when fear is tightening our hearts and gently, kindly invite them to open again. Each time we choose love over fear, even in small ways, we are strengthening a new pattern in the heart. We are teaching ourselves that love does not require fear as its companion. We are discovering that the more freely we give, the more we have to give. At the root of relational fear is often a deeper fear, the fear of being truly seen. We are afraid that if someone sees all of us, including the parts we have hidden, they will turn away. We are afraid that our true self is not lovable, and so we hide and perform and try to control what others see. But this hiding comes at a terrible cost. As long as we are hiding, we cannot truly be met. As long as we are performing, we cannot truly be known. We may receive approval for our performance, but this approval does not nourish us because we know it is not really meant for us. It is meant for the mask we are wearing. The path through this fear is the path of courage. Not the courage of warriors going into battle, but a gentler courage, the courage to be seen. The courage to take off the mask, even though we do not know what will happen when we do. The courage to offer our real self to another person and allow them to respond as they will. This is perhaps the deepest trust of all. Trusting that even if we are rejected, we will survive. Trusting that being known is worth the risk of being hurt. Trusting that somewhere, somehow, There are people who will see us as we are and love us not, despite our imperfections, but in some strange way because of them, because our imperfections make us real, and only what is real can truly be loved. When fear releases its grip on our relationships, something beautiful becomes possible. We can rest. We can rest in the presence of another person without constantly monitoring how things are going. We can enjoy a conversation without analyzing it for hidden meanings. We can spend time apart without spiraling into worry. We can receive love without questioning whether it is real. This resting is not complacency. It does not mean we stop caring for our relationships or take them for granted. It means we care for them from a place of peace rather than anxiety. We water the garden because we love watching things grow, not because we are terrified of what will happen if something dies. The Buddha spoke of a quality called passaddhi, often translated as tranquility or calm. This is the quality that arises when the agitation of fear settles, when the waters of the mind become still. In this stillness, we can see clearly. We can respond wisely. We can love fully. Our relationships long for this quality. The people in our lives long for us to meet them from this place of calm. And we long for it too, even if we have forgotten what it feels like. Fear in relationships, like fear in all things, tends to create what it fears. The watching and controlling and performing that come from fear slowly erode the trust and intimacy we most want to protect. But the reverse is also true. Trust tends to create what it trusts. When we can offer our presence without gripping, our love without conditions, our real self without masks, we create the possibility of connection far deeper than anything fear could achieve. This is not easy. Our fears are old and strong. Our habits of hiding and controlling are deeply worn into us by years of practice. We learned them young, often in situations where they made sense, where we genuinely needed to protect ourselves. We should not judge ourselves harshly for having learned what life seemed to be teaching us. But every moment offers a new opportunity. Every interaction is a chance to choose trust over fear, openness over protection, realness over performance. We do not have to transform all at once. We simply have to be willing to experiment, to try a little more openness here, a little more authenticity there, and to notice what happens when we do. The people in your life do not need you to be perfect. They need you to be present. They do not need you to have all the answers. They need you to be willing to sit with them in the questions. They do not need you to never make mistakes. They need you to be human with them as they learn to be human with you. This is the heart that trusts. This is the love that sets down fear. This is the connection that we have been seeking all along. Rest here for a moment in the warmth of this possibility before we continue on together. We have been exploring fear in the realm of relationships, seeing how it tightens our hearts and prevents the very intimacy we long for. Now let us turn inward to look at something even more fundamental: the fear that arises from who we think we are. Each of us carries around a picture of ourselves. It is built from memories and experiences, from things others have told us, from comparisons we have made, from successes we have achieved and failures we have tried to forget. This picture feels very real to us. It feels like who we actually are. But if we look closely, we begin to see something interesting. This picture is not a simple reflection of reality. It is a construction. It is curated, edited, shaped to show us in a particular light. And we are constantly working to maintain and protect this construction, often without realizing we are doing so. The Buddha taught that much of our suffering comes from this constructed self, this image we cling to and defend. He called it attachment to self, and he suggested that it is one of the deepest roots of fear. For when we have built an image of who we are, we become terrified of anything that might threaten that image. We become afraid of failure, of embarrassment, of being seen as less than we wish to be. Let us explore this through a story. There is a tale told in many lands about a wise old teacher who was known throughout the region for his depth of understanding and his unusual ways of instruction. He had many students who came to learn from him, and he was greatly respected by all who knew him. One day, this teacher announced that he would take his students on an outing to a traveling fair that had come to the nearby town. The students were surprised and delighted. Their teacher was a serious man, devoted to contemplation and wisdom. What could he want with the entertainments of a fair? But they trusted him, and so they went. The fair was alive with color and noise. There were merchants selling spices and fabrics, musicians playing lively tunes, children running and laughing, animals performing tricks. The students wandered through it all with wide eyes, enjoying the spectacle but wondering why their teacher had brought them here. Then they came upon a game of archery. A target had been set up at one end of a clearing, and for a small fee, anyone could try their luck with a bow and arrows. Hit the center of the target, and you would win a prize. The old teacher stopped and watched for a moment. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he approached the gamekeeper and paid for 3 arrows. The students looked at one another in confusion. Their teacher was a man of books and meditation. What could he know of archery? They had never seen him hold a weapon of any kind. This seemed like a recipe for embarrassment. But the teacher simply smiled and took up the bow. He fitted the first arrow, drew back the string, and released. The arrow flew weakly through the air and landed in the dirt, far short of the target. It had not even come close. A few people in the crowd began to snicker. The teacher turned to his students with a peaceful expression. That, he said calmly, was the shot of a hasty person. Someone who acts without thinking, who rushes ahead without preparation, who lets impatience guide their hand. The students nodded slowly, beginning to understand that a lesson was unfolding. The teacher fitted his second arrow. This time he took longer, pulling the string back further, aiming with apparent care. He released, and the arrow flew with much more force. But it veered wildly to the side, missing the target by a great distance. The crowd laughed openly now. This old man clearly had no idea what he was doing. But again, the teacher seemed untroubled. He turned to his students and said, "That was the shot of an arrogant person. Someone who is overconfident, who believes their effort alone guarantees success, who does not respect the difficulty of what they are attempting." The students leaned in, fascinated. What would the third arrow teach them? The teacher fitted his final arrow. He stood quietly for a moment, breathing slowly, his body relaxed but attentive. Then, in one fluid motion, he drew and released. The arrow flew straight and true, striking the very center of the target. The crowd gasped and then cheered. As the teacher collected his prize, one of his students approached him with a question. "Teacher, you told us the first arrow was the shot of a hasty person, and the second was the shot of an arrogant person. But what was the third arrow? Whose shot was that? The teacher smiled. Why, that was my shot, of course. That was me. This simple story contains a profound teaching about how we construct our sense of who we are. Notice what the teacher did. When the arrows missed, he attributed those shots to qualities he was demonstrating: hastiness, arrogance, as if those shots belonged to someone else. But when the arrow hit the center, he claimed it fully. That was me. This is exactly what we all do, though usually without the self-awareness the teacher was demonstrating. When things go well, we take credit. That was me. My skill, my effort, my intelligence, my worth. We weave our successes into the story of who we are. But when things go poorly, we find ways to distance ourselves. That was not really me. I was tired. I was distracted. I was having an off day. The circumstances were against me. Someone else was at fault. We push our failures to the edges of our identity, treating them as anomalies that do not reflect our true self. Through this selective process, we build an image of ourselves that includes mostly our best moments and excludes most of our worst ones. We become, in our own minds, the person who hits the target, not the person who misses. This construction happens so naturally, so automatically, that we rarely notice we are doing it. It feels like we are simply perceiving reality accurately. Of course, my successes represent who I really am. Of course, my failures were exceptions caused by circumstances beyond my control. This seems obvious, self-evident, not even worth questioning. But if we pause and look honestly, we begin to see the selectivity at work. We begin to notice how we emphasize certain memories and downplay others, how we tell the story of our lives in ways that cast us in a favorable light, how we compare ourselves to others in ways that make us feel better about ourselves. And then we become terrified of missing. Because if we have built our identity around success, then failure threatens not just our goals but our very sense of self. If we have told ourselves we are the person who always hits the target, then missing calls everything into question. Who are we if we are not the person we thought we were? This is the deep root of so much of our fear. The fear of failure, the fear of embarrassment, the fear of being seen as incompetent or foolish. These fears are not really about the failure itself. They are about what the failure might mean for the self we have constructed. The Buddha taught that this constructed self is not solid, not permanent, not ultimately real. He called it anatta, sometimes translated as not self or non-self. This teaching is often misunderstood as meaning that we do not exist at all. But that is not quite what it points to. What the Buddha was pointing to is that the fixed, solid, permanent self we imagine ourselves to be is a kind of illusion. It is a story we tell, a construction we maintain, but it does not have the solidity we attribute to it. When we look closely, we find that this self is constantly changing, constantly being revised, constantly being propped up by our thoughts and beliefs. And because it is a construction, it can feel very fragile. It requires constant maintenance. We must keep achieving to prove our competence. We must keep receiving approval to confirm our worth. We must keep avoiding failure to protect our image. It is exhausting work, and it never ends. But here is the liberating possibility the Buddha offered. If this solid self is not ultimately real, then we do not have to defend it so fiercely. If our identity is not actually at stake every time we make a mistake, then mistakes lose their terror. If who we are is not defined by our successes and failures, then we are free to succeed and fail without our very being hanging in the balance. This is a radical freedom. It does not mean we stop caring about doing well or that we become indifferent to outcomes. It means we stop making outcomes a matter of existential survival. We can try things, fail at them, learn from them, and move on without the crushing weight of believing that our failures define us. Perhaps no fear is more common than the fear of looking foolish in front of others. We dread embarrassment. We avoid situations where we might make mistakes in public. We hold back from trying new things because we cannot bear the thought of appearing incompetent. This fear keeps us small. It prevents us from learning, from growing, from taking the risks that lead to new possibilities. It traps us in a narrow range of behaviors where we feel safe, where we know we can perform adequately, where the chance of embarrassment is low. And the tragedy is that this narrow range grows narrower over time. The less we risk, the more frightening risk becomes. The more we avoid embarrassment, the more devastating embarrassment feels when it inevitably occurs. We build walls around ourselves that grow higher and thicker with each passing year. Think of how this fear affects something as simple as learning a new language. To learn to speak a foreign tongue, we must be willing to stumble, to mispronounce, to use wrong words, to sound foolish to native speakers. There is no other way. Fluency comes only after a long period of awkward, mistake-filled practice. But many people never learn new languages, even when they want to, because they cannot bear this period of awkwardness. The fear of sounding foolish is stronger than the desire to communicate. And so they remain silent, trapped by an image of themselves as someone who speaks correctly or not at all. This same pattern plays out in countless areas of life. We do not ask questions because we fear looking ignorant. We do not try new activities because we fear looking clumsy. We do not share our creative work because we fear looking untalented. We do not express our feelings because we fear looking vulnerable. In each case, the fear of how we might appear prevents us from fully participating in life. There is a beautiful teaching about the value of what is called beginner's mind. This is the mind that approaches something without pretending to already know, without needing to appear expert, without the burden of maintaining an image of competence. Beginner's mind is fresh, open, curious. It is not afraid to ask obvious questions. It is not embarrassed to make elementary mistakes. It is not weighed down by the need to seem impressive. And because of this freedom, beginner's mind learns quickly. It sees things that the expert mind, trapped in its expertise, might miss. In the expert's mind, there are few possibilities. In the beginner's mind, there are many. This is because the expert has already decided what is true, what works, what matters. But the beginner is still discovering. Every door is still open. Every path is still worth exploring. Children naturally have beginner's mind. Watch a young child learning something new, and you will see a being who is not yet afraid of looking foolish. They try, they fail, they try again, they laugh at their mistakes, they keep going. There is a freedom and a joy in their learning that many adults have lost. What happened to that freedom? We learned to be self-conscious. We learned that mistakes could bring disapproval, mockery, shame. We learn to protect our image, and in doing so, we lost the openness that makes genuine learning possible. But beginner's mind can be recovered. It is not gone forever. It is simply covered over by layers of self-protection. When we begin to release our grip on the image of ourselves as someone who already knows, we rediscover the joy of not knowing. We become willing to be beginners again in any area of life, at any age. There is an old piece of wisdom that suggests when we make a mistake and others laugh, we should laugh with them. If we can laugh at ourselves, then the world is not laughing at us. It is laughing with us. And there is all the difference in the world between these two. When we take ourselves very seriously, when we are heavily invested in appearing competent and put together, then mockery feels like an attack. It feels like others are seeing through our facade, exposing the inadequate person we fear we might be underneath. This is painful, and so we do everything we can to avoid situations where it might happen. But when we hold ourselves lightly, when we do not need to maintain an image of perfection, then mockery loses its sting. We can join in the laughter. We can enjoy the humor of our own foolishness. We can be human together with those who witness our mistakes. This capacity to laugh at ourselves is one of the great gifts we can develop. It transforms potential moments of shame into moments of connection. It takes the power away from embarrassment and gives that power to joy instead. It signals to others that we are safe to be around, that they too can make mistakes in our presence without being judged. There is a story about a teacher who was conducting a ceremony, a very formal and important occasion with many people watching. In the middle of the ceremony, the teacher made a significant error, saying the wrong words at a crucial moment. Everyone noticed. There was an awkward silence. But the teacher simply smiled and said, "Well, now you all know that I am human like you," and then continued with the ceremony. The tension dissolved. The people present felt closer to the teacher than they had before. What could have been a moment of shame became a moment of connection. This is the power of holding ourselves lightly. Our mistakes, instead of being disasters to be hidden, become opportunities for genuine human meeting. They become gifts we give to others, permission for them to be imperfect too. They become doorways through which real relationship can enter. Imagine a place where you were genuinely permitted to make mistakes, not judged for them, not shamed for them, simply allowed to make them as part of the natural process of learning and growing. How would it feel to be in such a place? Most of us have rarely experienced this. From our earliest years, we learned that mistakes brought consequences, disapproval, criticism, punishment, withdrawal of love. We learned to fear making mistakes because mistakes meant pain. But there is a profound teaching hidden in this. When people are genuinely permitted to make mistakes, they make fewer of them. When the fear of failure is removed, performance improves. This seems paradoxical, but it makes perfect sense when we understand what fear does to us. Fear tightens us. It narrows our attention. It makes us rigid and reactive. Under the pressure of fear, we lose access to our creativity, our intuition, our natural intelligence. We become smaller, less capable versions of ourselves. But when the fear is gone, we expand. We relax. We can think clearly and respond flexibly. We have access to all our resources. And from this place of ease, we naturally do better. Some of the wisest leaders and teachers understand this. They create environments where mistakes are welcomed as part of learning, where failure is treated as information rather than catastrophe, where people are encouraged to take risks knowing that they will be supported whether they succeed or fail. In such environments, people flourish. They try things they would never have attempted under the pressure of perfectionism. They discover capacities they did not know they had. They grow in ways that would have been impossible if they were constantly afraid of making mistakes. How do we begin to loosen the grip of our constructed self, to free ourselves from the fear of failure and embarrassment that keeps us small? It begins with awareness, simply noticing how we construct our sense of self, how we claim our successes and disown our failures, how we curate our image and fear its dissolution. This noticing, done gently and without judgment, begins to create some space around the pattern. We can also practice holding ourselves more lightly. When we make a mistake, instead of rushing to explain it away or hide it, we can simply acknowledge it. Yes, I did that. It did not go well. And here I still am. The world did not end. My worth as a being did not diminish. We can cultivate a sense of humor about ourselves and our pretensions. The constructed self takes itself very seriously. It believes that its image is terribly important. But from a wider perspective, all of our posturing and image maintenance is rather funny. We are all, in our own ways, like the teacher at the fair, trying to appear more competent than we are, claiming our hits and disowning our misses. And we can remember the deeper teaching that who we truly are is not defined by success or failure, competence or incompetence, the approval or disapproval of others. There is something in us that remains whole and worthy regardless of how things turn out. The Buddha called it our true nature, and he taught that it is already perfect, already complete, already free. When we touch this deeper sense of who we are, the constructed self loses some of its power over us. We can still play the games of identity and achievement if we choose, but we are no longer enslaved by them. We can succeed without inflating, fail without deflating, and move through life with a lightness that the fearful self could never know. Let us return for a moment to the image of that old teacher at the fair, fitting arrow after arrow to the bow, missing and then finally hitting the center. What made his demonstration so powerful was not the successful shot. It was his equanimity through all three. He did not crumble when he missed. He did not puff up when he hit. He remained the same peaceful presence throughout, teaching his students that outcomes do not have to shake us, that we do not have to be defined by our performance, that there is a freedom available beyond success and failure. This freedom is available to each of us. It does not require that we stop caring about outcomes or become indifferent to how things turn out. It simply asks that we loosen our grip on the constructed self, that we stop making our worth contingent on our achievements, that we allow ourselves to be beginners, to make mistakes, to look foolish sometimes, and to laugh when we do. The world does not need our perfection. It needs our presence. It needs us to show up fully, to try things, to fail at some of them, to learn and grow and try again. It needs us to be human together, imperfect together, laughing together at the beautiful absurdity of it all. Rest here for a moment in this spacious possibility before we continue on together. We have been exploring the constructed self and how our fear of failure and embarrassment keeps us trapped in narrow patterns of safety. We have seen that when we hold ourselves lightly, when we can laugh at our mistakes and embrace our imperfections, a great freedom becomes available. Now let us go deeper still. Let us explore what happens when we are thrown into situations that seem impossible, when we face our fears not gradually but all at once, when life or circumstance or a wise teacher pushes us directly into the heart of what terrifies us most. There is a kind of learning that can only happen in the crucible. When we are comfortable, we may understand a teaching intellectually, but it does not transform us. It is only when we are tested, when we must apply what we have learned under pressure, that the teaching moves from our heads to our hearts and becomes truly ours. The great teachers of many traditions understood this. They did not always shelter their students from difficulty. Sometimes they deliberately created challenges, even ordeals, knowing that certain lessons can only be learned by going through the fire. Let us explore some stories of such learning. There is a story told about a young monk who had traveled far from his homeland to train in the ancient traditions of meditation and wisdom. He had been a monk for only a few years, still learning the language of his new country, still finding his way in a culture very different from his own. His teacher was a renowned master, known throughout the land for the depth of his understanding and the skillfulness of his instruction. Hundreds of monks trained under his guidance, and thousands of lay people came to hear his teachings on holy days and festivals. One such festival arrived, one of the most important of the year. It was a night of ceremony and celebration, when people from all the surrounding villages would gather at the monastery to offer candles and flowers, to chant the ancient verses, and to hear the Dharma, the teachings of truth. On this particular night, the great hall of the monastery was filled to overflowing. Thousands of people sat in orderly rows, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of countless candles. The air was thick with the scent of incense and flowers. There was a feeling of reverence, of expectation, of something sacred about to unfold. Outside, the night was dark and still. Inside, the hall felt like a world unto itself, a vessel of warm light floating in the vast darkness. The flames of the candles flickered gently, casting dancing shadows on the walls and ceiling. The murmur of voices gradually subsided as the time for teaching approached. A hush fell over the assembly. The young monk sat among his brothers, grateful to be part of such a beautiful occasion. He looked forward to hearing his teacher speak. The master's talks were always profound, always surprising, always exactly what was needed. He settled into his seat, preparing to receive whatever wisdom would be offered. But his teacher had other plans. As the time for the teaching approached, the master looked out over the gathered assembly of monks. His eyes moved slowly down the rows, pausing here and there, as if considering each one. The young monk felt his heart begin to beat faster. He knew what this meant. Sometimes the master would call upon another monk to give the teaching. Sometimes he would choose someone unexpected. The master's gaze passed by the most senior monks, the ones who had been training for decades, who spoke the language flawlessly, who could give eloquent talks on the subtlest points of doctrine. His eyes moved further down the line, past monk after monk, until they came to rest on the young foreigner, and stopped. "You," the master said, pointing directly at him. "You will give the teaching tonight." The young monk felt the ground shift beneath him. Surely there had been a mistake. He had been a monk for only a few years. His grasp of the local language was still uncertain. He had never given a formal teaching, never spoken to more than a handful of people at a time. And now he was being asked to address thousands on one of the holiest nights of the year, in the presence of his teacher and all his senior brothers. His mind raced through objections, excuses, pleas for mercy. But one look at his teacher's face told him there would be no negotiation. This was not a request. It was an instruction. And so, with legs that felt like water and a heart pounding against his ribs, the young monk rose and made his way to the front of the great hall. The sea of faces watched him approach. The candles flickered. The silence deepened. What happened next, the young monk could barely remember afterward. He stood before the sea of faces, opened his mouth, and began to speak. The words came haltingly at first, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables, searching for phrases that would convey what he wanted to say. He spoke of the basic teachings he had learned. He shared stories from his own limited experience. He offered whatever wisdom he had managed to gather in his few years of training. Sometimes he lost his way and had to pause, searching for the thread of his thought. Sometimes he mispronounced words and had to correct himself. Sometimes he simply stood in silence, not knowing what to say next. It was not a polished performance. It was not eloquent or impressive. By any conventional measure, it was probably not a very good talk at all. But he kept going. Minute after minute, he kept speaking. And somewhere in the midst of his struggle, something began to shift. The desperate grip of fear began to loosen. The frantic need to impress, to succeed, to not embarrass himself, began to release its hold. He was still afraid, but he was no longer controlled by his fear. He was doing the thing he feared most, and he was surviving. He was making mistakes in front of thousands of people, and the world was not ending. He was being seen as imperfect, as struggling, as very much a beginner, and somehow it was all right. When he finally finished and returned to his seat, he felt something he had not expected. Not shame or relief, though those were present too. He felt a strange lightness, as if a burden he had been carrying for years had suddenly been lifted from his shoulders. Later, his teacher caught his eye and gave a gentle nod. Nothing more. But in that nod was a world of meaning. The young monk understood. This had never been about giving a good talk. It had been about facing his fear. It had been about discovering that he could walk through the fire and emerge on the other side. There is another story from the same tradition about a monk who was given an even more extreme challenge. This monk was also a foreigner, also still learning the language, also relatively new to the monastic life. And like the young monk in the previous story, he was called upon to give a teaching to a gathering of lay people who had come to spend the night at the monastery. He rose and did his best. He spoke for an hour, struggling with the language, losing his train of thought, repeating himself when he ran out of new things to say. It was difficult, but he made it through. When the hour was complete, he prepared to bow and return to his seat. But his teacher called out from the back of the hall, "Continue." Another hour. The monk's heart sank. Another hour? He had barely survived the first one. He had already said everything he knew how to say. How could he possibly fill another hour? But there was no choice. He continued. He told the same stories again, approached the same teachings from different angles, filled time with pauses and reflections. Some people in the audience began to shift restlessly. A few got up and left. The monk felt his face burning with embarrassment, but he kept going. When the second hour finally ended, he was exhausted, certain that this ordeal was finally over. "Another hour," his teacher called. The monk could not believe it. This was too much. But he looked at his teacher's face and saw something. There was purpose. There was teaching. There was, beneath the surface sternness, something that might even have been compassion. And so he continued for a third hour. By now, most of the audience had left. Those who remained were clearly struggling to stay awake. The monk had nothing left to say. He stood in long silences. He repeated himself openly. He admitted that he had run out of words. It was agonizing. It was humiliating. It was the worst public speaking experience imaginable. When the third hour ended, he prayed that his teacher would finally release him. But once more the call came. Another hour. The fourth hour was a blur. The monk was operating beyond exhaustion, beyond embarrassment, beyond any sense of trying to perform well. He simply stood and let whatever words came out of his mouth come out. There was nothing left to protect, no image left to maintain. When it was finally over, when his teacher at last allowed him to stop, the monk sat down in a state of utter emptiness. He had been completely humiliated. He had given the worst talk in the history of talks. He had failed in every possible way. And yet, in the days that followed, he noticed something remarkable. The fear that had always accompanied his thoughts about public speaking was gone, not diminished. Gone. He had experienced the absolute worst, and he had survived. There was nothing left to be afraid of. From that day forward, he spoke freely and easily. Not because he had become a brilliant orator, but because he no longer cared about being brilliant. He had been terrible, publicly and completely, and the world had not ended. What more was there to fear? These stories illuminate a profound paradox in our relationship with fear. We spend enormous energy trying to avoid the things we fear, trying to make sure the worst case never happens. But often, it is only by going through the worst case that we become truly free. As long as we are avoiding our fears, those fears retain their power over us. They remain dark unknowns, monsters lurking just out of sight, capable of anything our imagination can conjure. We tiptoe around them, shape our lives to evade them, sacrifice opportunities and experiences to keep them at bay. And all the while, they grow larger in our minds. But when we face a fear directly, something shifts. The monster comes into the light, and we see it for what it actually is. Often it is smaller than we thought, less powerful, less terrible. And even when it is as difficult as we feared, we discover that we can survive it. We discover that we are larger than our fear. The Buddha spoke of this in his own journey. Before his enlightenment, he faced his deepest fears directly. He sat beneath a tree and refused to move, even as the forces of doubt and terror assailed him. He did not run. He did not seek safety. He met what arose with steadiness and presence, and in doing so, he found liberation. This is not to say that we should seek out suffering or deliberately put ourselves in harm's way. The path is not one of masochism or self-punishment, but it does suggest that our constant avoidance of difficulty may be keeping us trapped in fear, and that sometimes the way forward is through. When we face our fears directly, something changes in us. We discover that we are stronger than we thought. We discover that the things we dreaded are survivable. We discover that our worth is not actually diminished by failure, embarrassment, or struggle. These discoveries cannot be made from a safe distance. They can only be made by walking into the fire. The teachers in these stories might seem harsh, even unkind. Why would they put their students through such ordeals? Why not protect them, encourage them, build them up gradually? But these teachers understood something important. They understood that certain fears cannot be talked away. They cannot be reasoned with or gradually diminished through gentle exposure. They can only be faced. And sometimes, the most compassionate thing a teacher can do is to push a student into the very situation they most want to avoid. This is not done carelessly or without wisdom. A good teacher knows their students. They know who is ready for such a challenge and who is not. They know how far to push and when to relent. And they are present throughout the ordeal, holding space, offering silent support, ready to catch the student if they truly fall. The young monks in these stories were not abandoned to their fate. Their teachers were watching, aware of what was happening, available if truly needed. The ordeals were contained, bounded, survivable. They were difficult enough to transform, but not so difficult as to destroy. This is the art of teaching through challenge. It requires great skill and even greater compassion. It requires seeing the student's potential, not just their current limitations. It requires being willing to be seen as harsh or unkind in the moment, for the sake of the student's ultimate freedom. Most of us do not have teachers who will push us into our fears in this dramatic way. But life itself often serves this function. Life has a way of presenting us with exactly the challenges we most need, whether we want them or not. The person who fears abandonment finds themselves abandoned. The person who fears failure finds themselves failing. The person who fears being seen finds themselves suddenly visible. Life seems to have an uncanny ability to locate our fears and place us directly in front of them. This can feel unfair, even cruel. Why should we have to face the very things we most dread? Why does life not allow us to avoid what frightens us, to stay safe in our comfortable patterns? But perhaps there is wisdom in this seeming cruelty. Perhaps life, like a good teacher, knows that certain lessons can only be learned in certain ways. Perhaps the things we most fear are precisely the things we most need to face in order to grow into who we are meant to become. We can meet these moments in different ways. We can resist them, fighting against our circumstances, trying desperately to escape the very thing that has come to teach us. Or we can recognize them for what they are, opportunities disguised as disasters, crucibles in which something new can be forged. This is not easy. When we are in the midst of facing our fears, it does not feel like an opportunity. It feels like catastrophe. It feels like everything is going wrong. It feels like we are being punished or persecuted by a hostile universe. But if we can hold steady, if we can stay present with what is happening without running away, we may discover the same thing those young monks discovered. We may find that we are more resilient than we knew. We may find that the worst case, when it actually arrives, is not as terrible as we imagined. We may find a freedom on the other side that we could never have found any other way. One of the most liberating experiences in life is the experience of having nothing to lose. When everything we were protecting has already been lost, when the worst has already happened, when there is no image left to maintain and no reputation left to protect, a strange lightness descends. This is what the monk discovered after his 4 hours of failure. He had lost everything. His reputation as a competent speaker, his image as someone who had something worthwhile to say, his pride, his dignity, his sense of being able to perform adequately in public. All of it gone. And in that loss, he found freedom. There was nothing left to fear because there was nothing left to lose. He could speak or not speak, succeed or fail, impress or disappoint, and none of it mattered anymore. The stakes had been removed. The pressure had dissolved. He was free to simply be himself, whatever that turned out to look like. Many of the great spiritual teachers speak of this experience. They describe moments when everything fell away, when all their strategies for self-protection collapsed, when they found themselves naked and defenseless before life. And they describe these moments not as disasters, but as doorways, openings into a freedom that could not have been found any other way. We do not need to manufacture such moments. Life will provide them, in its own time, in its own way. Our task is simply to recognize them when they come, and to allow them to do their work on us, rather than fighting against them with all our might. There is a particular kind of courage required to allow ourselves to be transformed by difficulty. It is not the courage of fighting against our circumstances, though that has its place. It is the courage of staying present, of not running away, of allowing what is happening to touch us deeply. This courage is sometimes called the courage of vulnerability. It is the willingness to be affected, to be changed, to have our old ways of being broken down so that something new can emerge. It is the opposite of the defensive stance that keeps difficulty at arm's length, that refuses to let experience penetrate the armor we have built around ourselves. The young monks in our stories showed this courage. They could have refused their teacher's instructions. They could have run from the hall, pleading illness or incapacity. They could have stood before the audience with their armor fully in place, going through the motions while protecting their inner selves from the impact of the experience. But they did not. They allowed themselves to be vulnerable. They allowed the experience to affect them. And because they did, they were transformed. This is available to all of us. Every difficult moment carries within it the seeds of transformation. Every fear we face is an invitation to grow beyond our current limitations. The question is whether we will accept the invitation or turn away from it. As we bring this exploration to a close, let us hold in our hearts the image of that young monk, standing before a sea of faces, terrified and uncertain, speaking his halting words into the candlelit darkness. He did not know, in that moment, that he was being given a gift. He did not know that his teacher was offering him something precious, something that could not be given any other way. He knew only that he was afraid, and that he had to keep going anyway. This is so often how it is. The moments that transform us do not announce themselves as transformations. They announce themselves as difficulties, as challenges, as things we would rather avoid. It is only afterward, sometimes long afterward, that we recognize what was really happening, what was really being offered. The Buddha taught that this human life is precious beyond measure, precisely because it offers us the opportunity to awaken. And awakening does not happen in comfort and safety alone. It happens in the crucible. It happens when we face what we fear and discover that we are larger than our fear. May you have the courage to face your fears when life presents them to you. May you have the wisdom to recognize difficulties as doorways. May you discover, as those young monks discovered, that the worst case carries within it the seeds of freedom. And when you find yourself standing before your own 1,000 eyes, may you remember that you do not have to be brilliant or eloquent or impressive. You only have to be present. You only have to keep going. You only have to trust that what is happening is exactly what needs to happen, even when you cannot see how. Rest here for a moment in this quiet moment before we continue on together. We have been exploring what happens when we face our fears directly, when we walk through the fire and discover that we can survive what we thought would destroy us. We have seen that freedom often waits on the other side of the very experiences we most want to avoid. Now let us turn to something closely related, something that lies at the heart of so much of our fear: the need to control. Most of us spend a great deal of energy trying to control our lives. We make plans. We anticipate problems. We strategize and prepare. We try to think of every contingency, every possible thing that might go wrong, and we develop responses for each one. This seems sensible. It seems responsible. We are taught from childhood that planning is wise, that preparation prevents problems, that the careful person who thinks ahead will fare better than the careless person who does not. And there is some truth in this. A certain amount of planning is useful. It would be foolish to set out on a long journey without any thought of provisions, or to undertake a complex project without any sense of how to approach it. But there is a point where planning tips over into something else. There is a point where it becomes not a practical tool but an expression of fear. And when planning becomes fear-driven, it begins to cause more problems than it solves. Why do we feel such a strong need to control our lives? If we look closely, we often find that this need has its roots in pain. Somewhere in our past, something happened that we did not expect. Something hurt us. Something went wrong in a way we could not have anticipated. And in the aftermath of that pain, we made a silent vow. Never again. I will make sure this never happens again. And so we began to plan. We began to anticipate. We began to try to see around every corner, to prepare for every possibility, to leave nothing to chance. We built elaborate systems of control, all designed to protect us from ever being caught off guard again. This is understandable. It is a natural response to pain. When we have been hurt, we want to make sure we are not hurt again. And control seems to offer that assurance. If we can just plan well enough, prepare thoroughly enough, anticipate accurately enough, surely we can keep ourselves safe. But here is what we discover over time. We cannot control life. No matter how carefully we plan, no matter how thoroughly we prepare, life has a way of surprising us. Things happen that we could not have foreseen. Circumstances arise that we could not have anticipated. Our most careful plans are swept away by events we never imagined. And so our planning intensifies. If the last plan failed, we think, we simply need a better plan. More thorough, more comprehensive, more airtight. We double down on control, trying harder and harder to manage a reality that refuses to be managed. This is exhausting work, and it does not lead where we hope it will lead. It does not lead to safety. It leads to anxiety. It leads to rigidity. It leads to a kind of brittle tension that makes us less capable of responding to life as it actually unfolds. There is a deep irony in our attempts to control. The very control that we employ to create safety often creates the opposite. Consider the person who is so afraid of being abandoned that they try to control their relationships. They monitor, they check, they demand constant reassurance. They try to manage every aspect of their partner's behavior, hoping to ensure that the partner will never leave. But this controlling behavior pushes people away. It suffocates intimacy. It makes the relationship feel like a prison rather than a sanctuary. And eventually, the partner does leave, not because they were going to leave all along, but because the controlling behavior became unbearable. The fear of abandonment, expressed through control, created the very abandonment it was trying to prevent. Or consider the person who is so afraid of failure that they plan obsessively for every possible outcome. They cannot make a decision without analyzing it from every angle. They cannot take action without being certain of the result. They try to eliminate all risk, all uncertainty, all possibility of things going wrong. But this obsessive planning paralyzes them. While they are busy planning, others are acting. While they are waiting for certainty, opportunities pass them by. And eventually, they fail. Not because they were incapable, but because their fear of failure prevented them from ever truly trying. The fear of failure, expressed through excessive control, created the very failure it was trying to prevent. This pattern appears again and again. The control that arises from fear tends to create what it fears. It is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, a trap that tightens the more we struggle against it. There is a story about a person who was overseeing the building of a community gathering place. Many decisions needed to be made. What materials to use? What colors to paint the walls? How to arrange the rooms? Countless details, each of which someone had an opinion about. People would come to this person constantly, seeking guidance. Should we use this kind of wood or that kind? Should the windows face east or west? Should the main hall be large and open or divided into smaller spaces? And to almost every question, this person had the same response. That will do. At first, people were confused by this. They expected careful deliberation, strong opinions, detailed analysis of every option. They expected the person in charge to control every aspect of the project, to ensure that everything was exactly right. But that will do was all they got. And something remarkable happened. The project moved forward smoothly. Decisions that might have taken days of agonizing were made in moments. People stopped worrying so much about getting everything perfect and started simply doing what needed to be done. The atmosphere shifted from tension to ease, from anxiety to creativity. And the finished building was beautiful. Not because every detail had been obsessively controlled, but because the people working on it had been free to bring their own gifts, their own ideas, their own creativity to the task. The space that had been created by releasing control was filled by something better than control could have produced. That will do turned out to be a profound teaching in disguise. It was not carelessness or indifference. It was trust. Trust that things would work out. Trust that the people involved were capable. Trust that perfection was not necessary and that good enough was, in fact, good enough. We live in a time of unprecedented choice. Our ancestors faced a small number of options in most areas of life. What to eat was determined by what was available. What to wear was determined by what could be made. What to do for work was often determined by family tradition. But we face hundreds, sometimes thousands of choices in even the smallest matters. What to eat requires navigating endless options, cuisines, ingredients, preparations. What to wear requires selecting from vast arrays of styles, colors, fabrics. Even something as simple as choosing a color for a wall can involve studying charts with hundreds of shades, each subtly different from the next. This abundance of choice seems like a gift, but it carries a hidden burden. Each choice becomes an opportunity for fear. What if I choose wrong? What if there was a better option? What if this decision leads to regret? And so we agonize. We research. We compare. We seek opinions. We delay and deliberate, trying to be sure, trying to make the perfect choice. And often, we end up exhausted and dissatisfied, not because we chose poorly, but because the process of choosing drained all the joy out of whatever we chose. There is an old teaching that suggests much of this agonizing is unnecessary. The teaching is simple. There is no wrong choice. This seems impossible at first. Surely some choices are better than others. Surely some decisions lead to good outcomes and others to bad ones. How can there be no wrong choice? But consider this. Whatever choice you make, you will bring yourself to it. You will bring your creativity, your resilience, your capacity to adapt and grow. You will work with what you have chosen. You will learn from it, adjust to it, make something of it. The person who chooses one path and walks it wholeheartedly will often fare better than the person who chooses the perfect path but walks it half-heartedly, always wondering about the roads not taken. The choice matters less than what we bring to the choice, and so the agonizing is revealed as unnecessary. Choose, and then bring your full self to what you have chosen. That is enough. That will do. If we release our grip on planning and control, what do we put in their place? How do we face an uncertain future, if not by trying to anticipate and prepare for every possibility? There is a teaching that offers a surprisingly simple answer. The only preparation you truly need is to prepare your heart. Specifically, this means cultivating kindness. If you walk into any situation with a heart full of kindness, you are prepared for whatever that situation might bring. You do not need to know in advance what will happen. You do not need a plan for every contingency. You simply need to be kind. Think about this for a moment. When we try to plan for the future, we are essentially trying to figure out what to do in situations that have not yet arisen. But we cannot know what those situations will be. We cannot know what will be needed. Our plans, however elaborate, will always be incomplete. But kindness is always appropriate. Whatever happens, kindness is a fitting response. If someone is suffering, kindness meets them where they are. If someone is joyful, kindness celebrates with them. If there is conflict, kindness seeks resolution. If there is confusion, kindness offers patience. Kindness is not a single strategy, but a way of being that generates appropriate responses to whatever arises. It is flexible where plans are rigid. It adapts where preparations fall short. It draws on a deeper wisdom than the calculating mind can access. The Buddha spoke of kindness as one of the divine abodes, one of the highest states of mind available to human beings. When we dwell in kindness, we dwell in safety. Not the false safety of control, which is always being threatened by circumstances beyond our control, but the true safety of a heart that is at home in any situation, ready to meet whatever comes with an open and generous spirit. Alongside kindness, there is another quality that serves us better than planning. That quality is presence. When we are truly present, we are fully available to this moment. We are not lost in thoughts about the future, worrying about what might happen, planning our responses to imaginary scenarios. We are here, now, attentive to what is actually occurring. And from this place of presence, we can respond appropriately to whatever arises. We do not need to have figured it out in advance. We simply need to be awake and attentive, and the right response will emerge from that wakefulness. This is how skilled musicians improvise. They do not plan every note in advance. They are present to the music as it unfolds, listening deeply, responding in the moment. And from that presence, beautiful music emerges, music that could never have been planned because it is born from the living moment itself. This is how wise people move through life. They are not rigid adherents to predetermined plans. They are present to what is, responsive to what is needed, flexible in their approach. They trust that if they show up fully, the way forward will become clear. The Buddha emphasized this quality of presence throughout his teachings. He spoke of mindfulness, of clear awareness, of being fully awake to the present moment. This was not an add-on to his teaching, something to practice occasionally. It was the very heart of the path. When we are present, fear loses much of its power. Fear is almost always about the future, about what might happen, about what we might lose or suffer. But when we are anchored in the present moment, the future is revealed as nothing more than thought. And in this moment, right now, we are almost always safe. We are almost always capable of meeting what is here. There is a beautiful image that captures this way of moving through life. It is the image of a river. A river does not plan its course. It does not analyze the terrain in advance and decide the optimal path to the sea. It simply flows. When it meets an obstacle, it goes around. When it finds a low place, it fills it. When it encounters a steep decline, it rushes. When it reaches a flat plain, it meanders. The river is endlessly adaptive because it is not attached to any particular route. It responds to what is in front of it, moment by moment, and in doing so, it always finds its way. We can learn to be like the river. We can release our insistence on a particular outcome, a particular path, a particular way things should unfold. We can meet each moment as it comes, responding to what is, rather than fighting for what we think should be. This is not passivity. The river is immensely powerful. It carves canyons. It shapes landscapes. It brings life wherever it goes. But its power comes not from forcing its will on the terrain, but from its willingness to work with the terrain, to find the path of least resistance while never losing its essential direction. We too have an essential direction. We too have somewhere we are going. something we are becoming. But we do not need to force our way there. We can trust the flow. We can release the struggle. We can let life carry us, even as we bring our own energy and intention to the journey. Let us sit with the radical simplicity of what we have been considering. What if we do not need all those plans? What if the elaborate strategies and contingencies we construct are not helping us, but exhausting us? What if there is a simpler way? The teaching is this: prepare your heart, not your defenses. Cultivate kindness and presence, not plans and controls. Show up fully to each moment, and trust that the moment will show you what is needed. This does not mean we become careless or irresponsible. We still look before crossing the street. We still show up on time for our commitments. We still take reasonable care of our health, our relationships, our resources. But we release the anxious need to control what cannot be controlled. We stop trying to manage every variable. We accept that life is uncertain and always will be, and we find our safety not in certainty, but in our own capacity to respond to whatever comes. That will do becomes our mantra, not as an expression of giving up, but as an expression of trust. Trust that we are capable. Trust that the universe is not hostile. Trust that good enough is good enough, and that perfection is neither possible nor necessary. The Buddha taught that clinging is the root of suffering, and there is perhaps no clinging more pervasive than our clinging to control. When we can release this clinging, when we can open our hands and let life be what it is, a great peace becomes available. Rest here for a moment in this spacious trust before we continue on together. We have been exploring the freedom that comes from releasing our grip on control, from trusting the flow of life rather than fighting to manage every detail. We have seen that kindness and presence serve us better than the most elaborate plans. Now, let us go further still. Let us explore what it means to meet even the most difficult circumstances with equanimity, with acceptance, perhaps even with a kind of lightness that seems impossible when we are caught in the grip of fear. This is delicate territory. We are not speaking here of denial or avoidance, not suggesting that we pretend difficulties are not difficult or that losses do not hurt. Pain is real. Grief is real. The challenges of human life are real. To suggest otherwise would be both unkind and untrue. But there is something beyond our initial reactions to difficulty. There is a place we can reach with practice and understanding, where even the hardest things can be held with a kind of spacious peace. This is not the same as not feeling. It is feeling fully while also resting in something larger than our feelings. The Buddha taught that suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our resistance to what happens. When we cling to how things should be, we suffer when they are otherwise. When we insist that life conform to our preferences, we suffer when it does not. But when we can open to what is, when we can say yes to life as it actually unfolds, something shifts. The suffering loosens its grip, and in its place, something unexpected can arise. Sometimes that something is peace. Sometimes it is wisdom. And sometimes, remarkably, it is laughter. There is a story told about an elderly teacher, a monk who had spent decades guiding students on the path of awakening. He was known throughout his community for his warmth, his wisdom, and his ability to help others find peace in difficult circumstances. He had written books that had touched countless lives. He had given teachings that had opened many hearts. One day, this teacher went to see a doctor about some symptoms that had been troubling him. Tests were done. Results were analyzed. And then the doctor sat down with him to deliver the news. The diagnosis was serious. A terminal illness. The kind of news that changes everything. That divides life into before and after. The doctor delivered this news with the gravity it deserved, preparing himself for the reaction that such news typically brings. Shock. Denial. Grief. Fear. But that is not what happened. The old monk listened carefully to everything the doctor had to say. He asked a few questions to make sure he understood clearly. And then, to the doctor's complete astonishment, he began to laugh. Not a bitter laugh, not a hysterical laugh, but a genuine laugh of what seemed like delight. As if he had just heard wonderful news rather than terrible news. As if a burden had been lifted rather than imposed. The doctor did not know what to make of this. In all his years of practice, he had never seen anyone respond to such a diagnosis with laughter. He later said that this monk was the only person he had ever met who laughed upon learning they were facing the end of their life. What did this teacher understand that allowed him to respond in such a way? What kind of freedom had he found that made even the most profound news a cause for lightness rather than despair? To understand the monk's laughter, we must understand a way of seeing that is available to all of us, though most of us have not yet learned to access it consistently. Every situation, no matter how difficult it appears, contains within it both loss and possibility. Every change, no matter how unwelcome, closes some doors while opening others. Every ending is also a beginning. This is not mere optimism or positive thinking. It is simply the nature of how things are. When we receive difficult news, our attention naturally goes to what we are losing. This is understandable. Loss is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged. But if we look with wider eyes, we can also see what we might be gaining. The monk who laughed at his diagnosis had perhaps considered something like this. He was old. He had lived a full life. And ahead of him, had he continued to live many more years, lay the gradual changes that come with advanced age. The slow shifting of faculties. The increasing need for support from others. The particular challenges that sometimes accompany the final years of a very long life. But now, it seemed, his journey would come to its natural completion sooner than expected. He would not have to endure years of uncertainty about his own capacities. He would complete his time here while he was still himself, still able to teach, still able to love, still able to be fully present with those who came to him. Is this not, in its strange way, a kind of gift? We do not know exactly what the monk was thinking. Perhaps his reasons were different from these. Perhaps his laughter came from an even deeper place, a place beyond reasons altogether, a place of pure acceptance and trust. But his response points to a truth that we can all learn from. There is always another way to see. This capacity to see differently is sometimes called reframing. It is the ability to take a situation that appears one way and find another way to understand it. Not to deny the difficulty, but to expand our view so that the difficulty is not all we can see. This is not about pretending that hard things are easy. It is not about forcing a smile when we are in pain. It is about recognizing that our initial reaction to events is not the only possible reaction, and that with practice, we can learn to find perspectives that bring us more peace. The Buddha spoke of right view as the first step on the Noble Eightfold Path. Right view is not about seeing things the way we wish they were, but about seeing them clearly and completely. And complete seeing always includes more than our fear-driven first impressions reveal. Consider the fear of losing a job. For many people, this is a significant source of anxiety, especially in uncertain economic times. The mind generates frightening pictures. How will I pay my bills? What will happen to my family? What if I cannot find another position? The fear is real and understandable. But let us look again. What else might job loss contain, besides loss? It might contain rest. The person who has been working tirelessly, with no pause, suddenly has time. Time to breathe. Time to think. Time to remember what matters. The forced stopping, while frightening, might also be exactly what was needed. It might contain redirection. Perhaps that job was not the right fit. Perhaps it was draining more than it was giving. Perhaps there is work out there that would be more fulfilling, more aligned with deeper values. The loss of one door might be what finally pushes someone through a better door. It might contain simplification. The lifestyle that required that income might have been more burden than blessing. The loss might be an invitation to live more simply, more freely, with less to maintain and protect. None of this makes job loss pleasant. But it does suggest that job loss, like all things, contains more than one story. And the story we choose to tell ourselves makes an enormous difference in how we experience what happens to us. There is another common fear worth examining through this lens. The fear of failure that haunts students facing tests and examinations. How much anxiety is generated by these experiences? How many sleepless nights? How many worried hours? How much suffering is caused by the fear of not performing well enough? The stakes feel so high. The consequences of failure seem so dire. But let us look again. What happens if you pass your examination? You advance to the next level. You face new challenges, new tests, new opportunities to fail. The pressure continues. The demands increase. You have earned the right to keep struggling. And what happens if you do not pass? Perhaps you take the test again, better prepared this time. Perhaps you find a different path, one that does not require this particular credential. Perhaps you discover that the thing you were pursuing was not what you really wanted after all, and the experience frees you to seek something better. Passing and not passing are not as different as they appear from the inside of our fear. Both lead somewhere. Both open certain doors and close others. Both are workable. Both contain possibilities. When we can see this clearly, the terror of failure begins to loosen. We still do our best, still prepare, still care about outcomes. But we are not crushed by the fear of things going differently than we hoped, because we understand that different can also lead somewhere good. Here is another example of how this reframing can work. Imagine someone who has planned a journey to a distant land. They have been looking forward to this trip for months, but just before they are to depart, news arrives of some uncertainty in the region. Perhaps there is an illness spreading. Perhaps there is unrest. Perhaps there is simply unpredictable weather. Friends and family urge caution. Perhaps you should not go. What if something happens? The fear is contagious, and the traveler begins to waver. But let us look at this with wider eyes. What if they go and encounter difficulty? Perhaps they become unwell and must rest for a time. But resting in a foreign land, cared for by kind strangers, might be its own kind of adventure. They might meet people they would never have met otherwise. They might discover reserves of resilience they did not know they had. They might have a story to tell for the rest of their lives. And what if they go and everything is fine? Then they have had their journey, their adventure, their expansion of horizons. They have refused to let fear dictate their choices. They have lived fully instead of cautiously. Either way, something valuable is gained. The only thing lost by going is the illusion of safety that comes from staying home. And that safety is always an illusion anyway, for difficulty can find us anywhere, and no place is truly secure. The traveler who understands this can make their choice freely, without the weight of fear distorting their judgment. They can go or stay based on what they actually want, rather than on what fear tells them they should do. What we are describing is a quality that the Buddhist tradition calls equanimity. It is one of the 4 divine abodes, along with loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy. It is considered one of the highest attainments of the spiritual life. The Pali word for equanimity is upekkha, which carries the sense of looking over, of seeing from a higher perspective, of having a panoramic view rather than being caught in the details. It suggests stepping back far enough to see the whole picture, not just the part that is troubling us. Equanimity is sometimes misunderstood as coldness or indifference. But true equanimity is neither of these. It is a warm and open acceptance of things as they are. It is the capacity to remain balanced and peaceful regardless of whether circumstances are pleasant or unpleasant, favorable or unfavorable. The person with equanimity still feels. They still experience joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain. They are not numbed or detached from life, but they are not thrown by what they experience. They can feel the full range of human emotion without being capsized by any of it. This is the quality that allowed the old monk to laugh at his diagnosis. He was not indifferent to his situation. He simply was not afraid of it. He had made peace with the nature of things, with the truth that all who are born must also complete their journey here. And from that place of peace, even the most profound changes could be met with lightness. The Buddha spoke of equanimity as being like the earth. The earth receives everything that falls upon it, pleasant and unpleasant alike. It does not react with excitement when flowers bloom upon it, nor with distress when storms rage across it. It simply receives, accepts, and continues to be what it is. We can cultivate this quality. It is not something that only special people have access to. It is a capacity that lies within all of us, waiting to be developed. Through practice, through reflection, through gradually releasing our insistence that things be other than they are, we can grow into this spacious acceptance. There is something particularly powerful about laughter in the face of difficulty. It is a sign that fear has lost its grip, that we have found a place beyond the reach of circumstance. This is not the nervous laughter that comes from discomfort, nor the cruel laughter that comes from mockery. It is the genuine laughter of someone who has seen through the heaviness of the situation to something lighter beyond it. Life, from a certain perspective, is a great mystery, full of unexpected turns, We take so many things so seriously, things that will not matter at all in 100 years, things that barely matter now. We worry and struggle and fight for outcomes that, in the grand scheme of things, are of little consequence. We act as if our preferences and opinions and plans were of cosmic importance, when really they are just the small concerns of small creatures on a small planet in a vast universe. When we can see this clearly, laughter naturally arises. Not laughter at ourselves in a diminishing way, but laughter at the great comedy of taking everything so seriously. It is the laughter of relief, the laughter of liberation, the laughter that comes when a great weight is set down. The old monk who laughed at his diagnosis had perhaps glimpsed this perspective. He had perhaps seen that even the most significant changes were not as heavy as we make them. He had perhaps touched a place in himself that was larger than any circumstance, and from that place, laughter was the only fitting response. This lightness is available to all of us. We do not have to wait until we are old and wise to access it. We can begin to cultivate it now, in the small difficulties of daily life, so that it will be available to us when larger difficulties arrive. The next time something goes differently than you hoped, pause before reacting. Ask yourself, what else might this contain? What possibility hides within this apparent problem? What door might be opening as this door closes? This is not about forcing yourself to feel positive when you feel something else. It is simply about looking more widely, seeing more completely, recognizing that your first reaction is not the only possible reaction. And when you can find that wider view, notice how it feels in your body. Notice how something releases, how the breath deepens, how something softens in the chest. This is the physical signature of equanimity, the felt sense of being at peace with what is. Over time, this way of seeing becomes more natural. We begin to meet difficulties with curiosity rather than dread. We begin to look for the hidden gifts rather than seeing only the obvious losses. We begin to hold life more lightly, knowing that whatever comes, we can work with it. And sometimes, when the moment is just right, we might even laugh. Let us hold in our hearts the image of that old teacher, sitting in the doctor's office, receiving news that would have devastated most people. Let us imagine the doctor's confusion, the strangeness of hearing laughter where tears were expected. And let us ask ourselves, what would it take to meet our own difficult moments with such grace? What would we need to release? What would we need to understand? What would we need to trust? The path to such freedom is not short, but it is available. Every day offers opportunities to practice. Every difficulty, large or small, is an invitation to see more widely, to hold more lightly, to trust more deeply. We cannot control what happens to us. The circumstances of our lives are largely beyond our choosing. But we can choose how we meet what happens. We can choose fear or trust, contraction or expansion, heaviness or lightness. In every moment, this choice is available. The monk who laughed was not special in the sense of being different from the rest of us. He had simply practiced for a long time. He had learned, through years of meditation and reflection, to hold life lightly. He had made friends with uncertainty. He had released his grip on how things should be and learned to embrace how things are. This is available to all of us. Not all at once, but gradually, moment by moment, choice by choice. Rest here for a moment in the possibility of such lightness before we continue on together. We have traveled far together on this journey through fear and freedom. We have explored how fear operates in our bodies and our relationships. We have seen how the constructed self creates so much of our anxiety, and how facing our fears directly can liberate us from their grip. We have discovered the freedom that comes from releasing control and trusting the flow of life. We have touched the lightness that is possible even in the most difficult circumstances. Now let us descend into the deepest waters. Let us explore what happens when we turn inward into the stillness of meditation and begin to release our grip on even the most fundamental things we think we are. This is delicate territory. The fears we encounter in meditation are different from the fears of daily life. They are subtler, more primal, closer to the root of our being. They do not announce themselves with racing hearts and sweating palms. They whisper from deeper places, from the very foundations of how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. And yet, these deep fears follow the same patterns we have been exploring all along. They arise from attachment, from clinging, from the belief that we must hold on to something to survive. They are born from the conviction that we are separate, limited, vulnerable, and that something terrible will happen if we let go. When we can release even these deep attachments, something remarkable becomes possible. A peace beyond ordinary peace. A freedom beyond ordinary freedom. The Buddha called this the end of suffering. Others have called it awakening, liberation, the discovery of our true nature. Let us explore what this might mean. Most of us, when we first turn our attention inward, discover something surprising. The mind is incredibly busy. There is a constant stream of thoughts, images, memories, plans, worries, fantasies. It is like a radio that never stops playing, a voice that never stops talking, a river that never stops flowing. The Buddhist teachings sometimes call this the monkey mind, because it leaps from branch to branch, never resting, always grasping at the next thing. Others have called it the second mouth, the one inside our heads that is always talking even when our outer mouth is silent. This busyness is so constant that we often do not notice it. It is the background noise of our existence, so familiar that it seems like silence. It is only when we sit down to meditate, when we try to be still and quiet, that we realize how loud it actually is. And for many people, this discovery is frightening. We have become so identified with our thinking that we do not know who we would be without it. The constant chatter of the mind feels like the voice of ourself. If that voice were to stop, we fear, we might disappear. We might cease to exist. We might fall into some terrible void from which there is no return. This fear keeps many people from going deep in meditation. They approach the edges of stillness, and something pulls them back. They touch the possibility of silence, and fear floods in. Better to stay with the familiar noise, the mind seems to say, than to risk the unknown quiet. But this fear, like all fears, is based on a misunderstanding. When the thinking mind grows quiet, we do not disappear. We do not fall into a void. We do not cease to exist. Instead, we discover something we had overlooked in all the noise. We discover the awareness that was there all along, beneath the thoughts, between the thoughts, holding the thoughts like a sky holds clouds. This awareness is not a thing we can point to or describe. It is more like a space, a vastness, a peaceful presence that is always here whether we notice it or not. The thoughts arise in this awareness, and dissolve back into it. They come and go like waves on the ocean, but the ocean remains. When we touch this awareness directly, something releases. The fear of silence dissolves because we realize that silence is not emptiness. It is fullness. It is not the absence of self. It is the presence of something deeper than the self we thought we were. The Buddha spoke of this as the discovery of the deathless, the unconditioned, that which does not arise and pass away. Different traditions have given it different names, but the experience is remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. When the noise of the mind settles, there is peace. When the grasping stops, there is freedom. When we stop trying to be someone, we discover what we always already are. This discovery is not the end of thinking. Thoughts continue to arise, as they must, as long as we have a brain and a body. But our relationship to thinking changes. We no longer believe that we are our thoughts. We no longer fear what might happen if thinking stops. We have found a place to stand that is deeper than thought, and from that place, thoughts are simply weather passing through a vast and cloudless sky. As meditation deepens, something else begins to happen. The sense of the body, usually so solid and present, begins to soften and fade. The boundaries that normally seem so clear, the edges of skin, the weight of limbs, the felt sense of being located in a particular place, all of this becomes less distinct. For many people, this is frightening. We are so identified with our bodies. We have spent our entire lives looking out through these eyes, moving through space in this form, feeling the world through this skin. The body feels like home. The body feels like who we are. When the sense of the body begins to dissolve in meditation, it can trigger a primal fear. What is happening? Am I dying? Am I losing myself? The mind scrambles to grab hold of something solid, to pull itself back from the edge of whatever abyss seems to be opening. But once again, this fear is based on a misunderstanding. The body is not disappearing. It is simply becoming transparent. The heavy, solid sense of being a body is being revealed as what it always was, a construction of the mind, a way of organizing sensation, a map rather than the territory itself. Beneath the constructed sense of body, there is simply sensation. Flowing, changing, arising, and passing. And beneath even sensation, there is awareness. The same awareness that holds thoughts also holds sensations. The same vastness that we discover when thinking settles is here when the sense of body softens. Those who have gone deeply into this territory report that the fading of the body sense is not frightening but freeing. The aches and pains that usually clamor for attention grow quiet. The heaviness of physical existence lifts. There is a sense of lightness, of spaciousness, of being unbounded by the usual limits. This is not an escape from the body. When meditation ends, the body returns, as solid and present as ever. But something has shifted. We know now that we are not only this body. We have touched something larger, something that the body appears within, something that is not born and does not die. Deeper still than thought, deeper than the sense of body, there is something else that meditation eventually invites us to release. This is the hardest thing of all. This is the will itself. The sense of being a doer, a chooser, a controller, the one who is making meditation happen, the one who is trying to achieve something. This one is very subtle. Even when thoughts have grown quiet and the body has become transparent, this one remains. The meditator, the seeker, the one who is trying to get somewhere, accomplish something, become something. And this one is afraid. It is afraid of what will happen if it lets go. It is afraid that without its effort, everything will fall apart. It is afraid that if it stops trying, nothing will happen. It is afraid, most of all, of its own dissolution, of discovering that it too is not solid, not permanent, not ultimately real. The deepest meditation requires the surrender of this one. It requires letting go of trying. It requires releasing the effort to meditate, the goal of achieving anything, the very sense of being someone who is doing something. This is the leap that many practitioners approach but few take. It feels too risky. It feels like giving up. It feels like everything we have been taught not to do. Our whole lives, we have been told to try harder, work more, never give up. And now the path seems to require the exact opposite. But this surrender is not defeat. It is not passivity. It is not giving up in the ordinary sense. It is recognizing that the very effort to awaken is what is preventing awakening. It is seeing that the seeker is what obscures the sought. It is understanding that we cannot make freedom happen. We can only stop preventing it. When this surrender happens, even for a moment, something extraordinary can occur. The separate self that we have taken ourselves to be is revealed as a construction, a pattern of thought and sensation, a habit of mind. And what remains when that construction is not being actively maintained is peace beyond description, freedom beyond imagination, the end of fear. The Buddhist tradition speaks of states of deep meditation called jhanas. These are profound absorptions, states of consciousness quite different from our ordinary waking state. In the jhanas, the usual noise and agitation of the mind settle completely. There is deep stillness, profound peace, often accompanied by bliss and well-being. Different teachers describe the jhanas in different ways, and there are various maps of the territory. But what they share in common is a description of progressive letting go. Each jhana involves releasing something that was being held in the previous one. First gross thinking goes, then subtle thinking, then the pleasure of stillness itself. Then even equanimity becomes an object to be released. At the deepest levels, what remains is awareness itself, pure and empty, without content or coloring. This is sometimes called the sphere of infinite space, or the sphere of infinite consciousness, or the sphere of nothingness, or the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. These exotic names point to states that are very difficult to describe, because they lie beyond the reach of ordinary concepts. We do not need to achieve these states to benefit from meditation. Even a few moments of genuine stillness, even a brief taste of the peace that lies beneath the noise, can transform our lives. But it is helpful to know that the path goes deep, that there are territories beyond what we can currently imagine, that the freedom promised by the Buddha is not a metaphor, but a real possibility. And at every level of this path, what is required is the same thing we have been exploring throughout this journey. Letting go, releasing the grip, trusting what happens when we stop controlling, not fighting, not forcing, not trying to make something happen, simply allowing, opening, surrendering. Now we can understand something important about the relationship between fear and attachment. The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering. We cling to things, to experiences, to ideas about ourselves, and this clinging creates pain when the things we cling to change or disappear. And everything changes. Everything disappears. This is the nature of conditioned existence. Fear is the anticipation of this pain. Fear arises when we sense, consciously or unconsciously, that something we are attached to is threatened. The greater the attachment, the greater the fear. When we are attached to our possessions, we fear losing them. When we are attached to our relationships, we fear abandonment. When we are attached to our reputation, we fear embarrassment. When we are attached to our beliefs, we fear being wrong. When we are attached to our bodies, we fear illness and aging. When we are attached to our very existence, we fear the great transition that awaits us all. The path through fear is the path of releasing attachment. Not through force, not through denial, not through pretending we do not care, but through clearly seeing that the things we cling to are not solid, not permanent, not ultimately ours. They are passing through. We are passing through. Everything is passing through. When we can see this clearly, something relaxes. The grip loosens. The fear subsides. Not because we have convinced ourselves that nothing bad will happen, but because we have stopped defining bad and good in terms of what we get to keep. This is the deepest freedom. This is what the Buddha was pointing to. This is what becomes available when we follow the path of letting go all the way to its end. What remains when fear is gone? What is it like to live without the constant hum of anxiety that most of us take for granted? Those who have tasted this peace describe it as coming home, as if they had been wandering for a very long time and had finally found their way back to where they belonged. There is a quality of settledness, of being at rest in a fundamental way, of no longer needing to get somewhere or become something. This does not mean that life becomes flat or uninteresting. Quite the opposite. When we are not constantly distracted by fear, we are more available to what is actually here. Colors seem more vivid. Sounds seem more beautiful. The simple act of breathing becomes miraculous. Life, freed from the filter of anxiety, reveals itself as extraordinary. There is also more room for love. Fear and love do not coexist easily. When we are afraid, we contract. We protect ourselves. We hold back. But when fear subsides, the heart naturally opens. We find ourselves more available to others, more able to connect, more willing to give and receive. The barriers that seemed so necessary, the walls we built to keep ourselves safe, turn out to have been keeping out the very things we most wanted. And there is a deep okayness that does not depend on circumstances. Things still go wrong. Difficulties still arise. Pain is still possible. Life does not become a constant stream of pleasant experiences. But there is a ground beneath all of it, a foundation that cannot be shaken, a knowing that whatever happens, it is all right. Not because everything is going well, but because everything is workable. Everything is part of the path. Everything belongs. The Buddha spoke of this as the peace that passes understanding. It is not a peace that comes from having figured everything out or having solved all problems. It is a peace that is prior to problems and solutions, prior to understanding and confusion. It is the peace of being itself, discovered when we stop adding so much to the simple fact of being alive. This peace is not reserved for monks or advanced meditators or special people. It is available to anyone who is willing to walk the path of letting go. It is our birthright, our deepest nature. What remains when we stop adding so much to the simple fact of being alive? We do not have to wait until we are perfect to taste it. We do not have to achieve anything or become anyone. We simply have to stop, even for a moment. Stop running. Stop fighting. Stop trying to control. And notice what is here when we are not so busy pushing it away. In this moment, right now, the peace is available. The fear is optional. The contraction is habit, not necessity. We can soften. We can open. We can let go. This is the invitation that meditation offers. This is the invitation that this entire journey has been pointing toward. Not to become someone new, but to discover who we have always been beneath the noise and the fear. Not to achieve something extraordinary, but to recognize the extraordinary in what is already here. The Buddha once said that his teaching was simple: suffering and the end of suffering. Everything he taught was about this: how suffering arises through clinging and fear, how suffering ends through letting go and waking up. May you find your way to this letting go. May you discover the stillness that waits beneath the noise. May you taste the peace that is your deepest nature, the freedom that has never been absent, the love that has been there all along. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.